Most of my pattern pieces are multi-pieced. This is my quilt pattern, and we're going to start out with the pattern itself, which is printed on recycled paper. There are 3 separate pieces that will eventually make a 5-inch block. We're going to take pattern piece 1 and pattern piece 2 on the A block, and we're going to take a postcard, put it on the line. We're going to fold the piece of paper, and what that's going to do is create a fold line, so when we flip it over on the back, we know exactly where that line is. It's also helpful if you have a light source and you can see the line through. You can do it either way. I prefer fold and flip. So the very first piece is the 1A piece, and 1A is part of the quill itself. This is going to be the stem of the quill. So I've picked my fabric for the stem of the quill. I'm going to put it over the A1 piece, making sure it covers the entire piece. And then I have an overlap of at least 1/4 inch or a little more. I'm going to take my A2 piece, which will be the ink on the tip of the quill, making sure that it covers the area where it will be flipped. So here's our A1 and A2. You can pin here at this point if you want to pin. Sometimes I pin if it's a large piece of fabric. If it's a small piece of fabric, I don't pin. We're going to use a small stitch, and we're going to stitch straight down the line. I like to take 1 or 2 stitches past the line to secure the seam. Now you can trim your threads now, or you can trim them at the end. It's really up to you. Sometimes I do both. We're going to fold this out and finger press. You can press with your iron, but if you press, only press. Don't use steam, and don't iron, only press. Now we're going to go to A3, flip and fold. We're going to trim to a generous 1/4 inch. And now we're going to need background fabric. So I'm going to take my background fabric. Background fabric is going to go right on the same corner. Remember where you've got a 1/4 inch seam. I'm going to flip it over, put it right here. We're going to go straight down that line and take a stitch past the line. So now we have two seam lines, and we have the tip of our ink. So I'm going to take this, I'm going to finger press it, flip it over, and at this point I'm going to go ahead and trim this down a little bit. We'll trim more off of that in just a minute. Right, we're going to go to pattern piece 4. Again, with the paper and the postcard, we're going to fold. I'm going to trim that. We'll flip this back, and we're going to piece 4. Make sure we have plenty of overlap. And see, I almost did it upside down, so we're going to flip that back over. We want right sides together. And then again, we're going to stitch. Leaving, we're going to go on over the line. We're going to flip, and we're going to finger press. Now this is a lot of excess, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold it along the next 2 lines for this side. So that's this line and this line, and then I'm going to go ahead and trim it in both directions. First I'm going to trim here, just past that second line, fold it again, make sure you have your fabric aligned with your pattern. You can pin it at this point if you're uncomfortable. So we've got 4, 5 is going to be up here. So next we're going to use our quill fabric for the actual feather part of the quill. I've chosen a lovely brown today. This part is a little trickier because you're looking at a piece of fabric that's going to fold over at an angle. So I always like to test fold just to see if the angle that I'm using, if my fabric is going to cover all of the pattern. So I'm going to take this here, I'm going to hold it taut. You can pin it if you're uncomfortable. I'm going to flip it, and we're going to stitch right past there, taking an extra stitch. Go ahead and trim off these threads. Now we are going to take and fold out our feather fabric. See, it covers all of our pattern where it is intended to. Now I'm going to go ahead and trim this excess off, get it out of the way. And a little trick that I've learned is that if you keep the card inside the pattern, when it's a long piece like this that you want to trim, it will keep your pattern and your fabric firm so that you can trim it more easily. Now the next piece is going to be this tiny little strip right here, which is actually the spine of the quill. I'm going to do the same thing we've been doing with the card fold. I'm going to trim. This is the same fabric I used for the spine of the quill, which was piece A1, so this is piece A6. We're going to put this on the side, making sure that we cover both ends. And then we're going to stitch all the way down. This is a tiny piece of fabric, but it's the small details like this that make the patterns that I design a little bit different. It may seem silly to have such a small piece in here, but what it's going to do is when you flip this and you press it, when you put this together, your quill will actually have a spine. Okay, so that's 6. Now we're going to move down here to 7, which is also background fabric. So once again we'll trim, and we trim through all the layers that we've accumulated to this point. We're going to take a piece of this background fabric. I'm trimming off camera a little bit, but mainly because I only want you to see my hands. But I cut my fabric as I sew. I do not pre-cut anything, mainly because I started out doing that and then I realized I was spending more time cutting than I was sewing, and I would rather be sewing and have a little bit of waste in my fabric than spend most of my time cutting, because if I'm going to be cutting with my rotary cutter, I might as well be traditionally piecing, which is something I also love to do. If I'm paper piecing, I want it to go a little bit faster. There are enough steps as it is without creating another one. So now we're going to trim all of this excess off. And 7, so our last piece is going to be this large piece of background fabric, which I'm going to use this large piece for. We're going to put this here, just like this. If you are uncomfortable with a piece of fabric that large, then you absolutely can pin. I recommend that you pin in a place where you're not going to be sewing over, because it just makes it easier and it's safer for you and your sewing machine. I'm going to make sure my fabric is taut and lined up, and I'm going to stitch all the way across. I'm going to flip this last piece. I'm going to finger press that, and I'm going to flip this back over. I'm going to go ahead and roughly trim it I like to give it a good 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch trim so that when I square it up, if I'm off anywhere, I can make it up when I'm squaring it up. So this is piece A, which we're going to put aside. Now we're going to pick up piece B, which is a very simple piece. We need a piece of our quill fabric and a piece of our background fabric. We're going to fold on the line, put our background fabric right on there. Oh, excuse me, that's the quill fabric. And then we're going to take the background fabric and use a rather large piece, but I will trim it off when I'm done. I'm going to make sure that we are above. If you can see the shadow on camera, but we're going to make sure we're above that sewing line, at least 1/4 of an inch. Stitch that line. And that is our B piece. I'm going to finger press our B seam, just like we did for the A seams. And again, I'm going to roughly trim the edges. And we're going to put that with our A piece. Now our C piece. Now I'm going to go ahead and fold this long line first, just so I get an idea where I'm supposed to overlap with my quill fabric. Go ahead and do our 2 piece. So I'm going to take my piece of fabric. That was not quite long enough, so I'll choose another one. This one's longer, so again, the first piece goes right side up. Make sure you're overlapping. I'm going to take a small piece of background fabric for this one, because we're going to do this angle first. Remember, you can pin on this part if you're uncomfortable sewing without pinning. I'm going to trim that off just slightly. Make sure this is lined up appropriately. Background fabric. And again to the sewing machine. Finger press. Flip. We're going to go on to piece 3, which is down on the end here. Again, giving us a trim. And we need another piece of background fabric, slightly larger than the last one. And place that here. Finger press. And let's go ahead and trim off this end bit so it's not flopping around on us. Going to fold here for piece 4, trim a small piece of background fabric. Notice my pieces are sometimes just scrappy pieces. I save my fabric. If it's bigger than an inch, I usually keep it, because a lot of my patterns have very small pieces and I can reuse that fabric, and sometimes just that little tiny piece of fabric is enough. If I have more of that fabric, I will keep it with the larger piece so it's easier to find. If I don't, then I have a storage container where I keep all my little pieces of fabric. And I fondly refer to it as my treasure chest. So now I've folded along the quill line. I'm going to trim all of this and trim all the way up. I'm going to put that away, and then we're going to have our last piece is background fabric. This is the piece of fabric I've been working off all this time for the background. So I'm going to line this up. It's more than enough for what I'm doing right now. I'm going to line this up, stitch across, and then I'll show you how to square this up before sewing these three parts together. Alright, I'm going to finger press, and then I'm going to give this a rough trim. And then we have our A piece, our B piece, and our C piece. They don't look very pretty right now, but they will after our next two steps. The next thing I'm going to do is press our pattern pieces that we just put together. So I've got them all right side up, and I'm literally going to press. My iron is on a medium setting. I'm just pressing seams gently, very gently, and I'm going to get these all pressed and nice, and then we're going to square this up. Okay, now that our squares are pressed, our pattern pieces, we are going to square these up. Now I have two rotary cutters, but I use an old blade for cutting my paper piecing because it allows me to cut through the paper without dulling a good blade. I'm only going to cut the inside lines. We will cut the outside lines after we've pieced the pattern. I'm giving a 1/4 inch seam allowance from my blue line, which indicates inside lines on my patterns. So we've got a 1/4 inch and a 1/4 inch. Now if your ruler shows you a 1/4 inch that is not the 1/4 inch that's on the pattern, go with your ruler. While I do try to always have a 1/4 inch, sometimes it's a little tiny bit less, sometimes it's a little tiny bit more. If you printed your pattern at 100%, it shouldn't be a problem. So I'm not going to snip this end off because I'm not sure how much of that I will need when I stitch this together. So let's get these pieces stitched together, and we'll find out what this quill is going to look like. Now we're going to attach our A piece to our B piece, and then we will attach all of that to the C piece. So we're going to find this outside corner with a pin. Find the outside corner with a pin here as well. I might take a few pokes. Once you've done it a little bit, it gets easier. So this is going to allow us to stitch this pattern piece on appropriately. So we're going to stitch this right here. This is a 1/4 inch seam. You can follow the paper because you've cut it a 1/4 inch, or you can follow your sewing machine. It should be the same. Now because this is an inside seam, I want to make sure that I sew all the way to the end. Okay, now we have A piece to B piece, and you can see the spine right there. Okay, now I like to tear away only the seam allowance. It decreases the bulk of the pattern, and it will allow me to press it a little bit nicer before I continue. So I'm going to finger press here. If you feel like you need to iron this, to press this with your iron, then press this with your iron, but it's not 100% necessary. Okay, now I'm going to, again, we're going to find the outside corner and the outside, see where I'm finding this right here. This is where the blue line meets the inside black line. I'm going to line that up as best I can. It's not always going to be 100% straight because you are dealing with multiple pieces, which is one of the reasons I like to leave extra on the outside, but we're going to get this as straight as we can. Once I have my needle set, I'm going to pull out my pin, and then we're going to stitch straight down. Okay, now we're going to take this off, we're going to pull it open, we're going to see what we have. A little string that needs to be trimmed. I'm going to pull that away. And we have our quill. It still looks a little messy, so again I'm going to remove the inside seam allowance from the paper. And then, like we did before, I will press the square and square it up. Go ahead and trim all this off, and then we'll square it up. We're going to go ahead and give this a press. Remember, it's just a press. We don't want any steam. We want to be gentle. We don't want to iron. We just want to press. I'm lifting my iron in between presses. And then we have a press square. Last but not least, we're going to square this up. I like to take one of the sides, if I have one, that has not been cut in any way. And if I don't have a side that hasn't been cut, which is true in some of the more complicated blocks, then I will take the straightest side and I'll start squaring up from there. Now when I square up, I cut one edge and then I use it as my guideline to cut the other sides. So I'm using my ruler as my guide. I'm pressing, holding it down tight so that it doesn't slide. So when you get that seam in the middle, sometimes it wants to move around, rock around a little bit. So we're going to hold this nice and tight, keeping our fingers far out of the way. Give this a trim, and there is our block. And that's it. We're done. Now we can paper piece to our heart's content.